Pemberton and Grant, new games in the blue and gray system by Worthington Games. This is a game that now has several games in it they're all about the American Civil War, and it is a game that is extremely minimalistic. It just has a very low count of units. It has 4 pages of rules, very simple, very basic, with a lot of work done at the level of the design to hardwire historical elements and factors and command, especially in the system. So you do not have to worry about it. You play and command happens. And in particular, you will see how this happens here. Pemberton and Grant, the Vicksburg Campaign of 1863. Grant is marching towards Vicksburg with some really big and mighty units, and the Confederates are scrambling around trying to figure out a defense, delay the unit as much as possible, maybe trying to figure out an opportunity for a counterattack, which however may be pretty tough. Let me show how the game works. This is the board of the game. It is a mounted board. It represents the areas around Vicksburg and Jackson. At the beginning of the game, those are the 2 main places where the Confederate player will be waiting for the arrival of the Union. There will also be a small group here, and Grant is coming from here. Other reinforcements will be brought by both sides during the game. And the point, the purpose, the goal for the Union player is to take control of key locations. If the Union player manages to take control of Vicksburg and Jackson at the same time, that is an instant victory for the Union player. The Confederate player can also achieve instant victory by eliminating a certain number of Union blocks. If neither condition is met until the end of the game, which is the last round of the game, the last turn of the game, then victory is based on victory points that only the Union player scores based on control of key locations on the map. And the Confederate player wins by preventing the Union player from winning. This is a point-to-point map. The playable areas pretty much only are these towns here and the connections between these towns, and then we have a terrain feature here, the river, that will make it more problematic for people that are attacking across a river. Another playable area and another playable connection is the railroad, which facilitates movement, but you only have a certain number of railroad movements available to you each turn. This is a block game. That means that the military units in the game are represented by wooden blocks, such as the ones that you see here. Wooden blocks during the game will stand upright on the board, and the number that you see on top represents the number of strength points that the unit has. When the unit takes a hit, you flip it to the next available number, and when it gets replacements, you flip it back in the opposite direction. Now, several units in this game are too large to fit on a single block. Like this would be the case, for example, of the 13 Union. That means that when a block gets to the red number on its block, when a unit gets to that number and the unit takes a further hit, you replace that block with the lower level, with the lower block representing the same group, the same military group, simply at lower quote-unquote health. If this unit was at 9, takes a hit, goes to 8, it takes another hit, goes to 7, and so on and so forth. The red number is simply to remind you when you switch to the next block. That means, by the way, in case you haven't noticed, that the number of military units in this game is ridiculously low. These are all the military blocks that you find in the game. Yes, there are other blocks to keep track of trenches, command action points, victory points, turn, that kind of thing. But these are the fighters, these are the combatants, military units, garrisons, cavalry, and leaders. So really not many when you take into account that these stacks all represent only a unit each. These are 3 blocks for the same unit. There will only be one of them on the board at the same time. No more, because they represent different levels of organization and size and morale of the same group of people. So the Union really has only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 blocks that they can fight for, with The Confederates, not many more. Not many blocks start on the board, so not only do you have a lower count overall, but you start with an insanely low count of units, and then after some effort, bringing in some reinforcements, then you get to a just low count. Maybe you played in the past those games, maybe 3-point games in the Napoleonic 20 system. It's a game for Napoleonic battles in which you have about 20 meter units total on the board at any one time. This is, I would say, this is ACW 20 or 30 because you're not gonna have more than those units on the board. This also makes the game very easy to manage, very clear, intuitive, where everybody is. What you can do is very intuitive. And so this makes the game very, I believe, appealing to new wargamers because it's very approachable. Also, the rules are very short. The general rules for this game system and the unique rules for this game also are very short. Now, what happens in a turn? Well, turns have several phases. First, you check for weather, and you keep track of the weather here. Of course, if it starts raining, then there's bad stuff. Movement is impeded, and so on and so forth. Then players may receive replacements. That allows you to reintegrate points to a unit that lost them. Then we check for command action points, CAP for short. Each player has a number of command action points each turn. You roll dice to see if you get an extra point, and then players will spend those points, and you can keep track of how many you have here on the turn track, and you use those to perform actions. For example, it costs an action point to activate a unit for movement, 2 action points to move a unit on a railroad, that kind of thing. Also, you can spend, once you activate a unit for movement, you can spend those movement points for the movement, or also to do other things. For example, you can spend movement points to build trenches, which will give you an advantage in defense. Now, usually during the game, these blocks would be standing upright and facing only the owning player. Although, with such a low count of units, and with the fact that there isn't great variety here, the Union blocks are all big, the Confederate blocks are much smaller in strength, you're gonna get a really good sense of what the opponent has. There are other block games in which the opportunities for ambush and traps are much higher. So the blocks will be standing upright, and they will move along connections, and basically at the end of a movement phase, in all locations that have blocks on both sides, you will resolve a battle. And that is when you reveal the blocks that you have by flipping them face up and making sure they don't change the orientation, because again, the orientation is what tells us the number of strength points that the unit has. To resolve combat, you use this combat display here. You place the attacker and defender units in the attacker line and defender line. These represent the positions where you place the blocks that will be actually able to fight. I was talking about preserving the orientation, not cool. If the attacker crossed a river, then you have to make sure that you place those units that attack across the river there, because they're gonna have a penalty in the first turn. And the opponent goes in the defender line. Suppose that we had a combined attack and not all the units of the Union player crossed the river. Suppose this is the situation. Leaders will go in the reserve area, and they have special magic powers that may apply during the game. Fail morale, that is where you will place units that will fail their morale during combat. Speaking of other units, actually, before we talk about combat, cavalry units, you can see they're unusual. They don't really contribute to combat. What they do is they slow down enemy units by performing cavalry screenings. That is, when an enemy unit moves in a location that has cavalry, then you roll a die, and if the cavalry is successful, the moving enemy unit stops there, cannot move anymore, and the cavalry unit retreats by 1 spot. If you fail that die roll, the screening is not successful, the cavalry unit retreats by 3 spots, and the enemy unit can keep moving. Back to combat. It's very similar to what you have in other block games. And you refer to the numbers here to resolve combat. The number here again is the number of hit points or health points. When they go down to 0, the unit is eliminated, or when they go below the red number, you switch to the next block. This is the number of dice that the unit rolls in combat, and this is the morale. A defender rolls first, so they roll out their dice. In this case, say the Confederate is defending. The Confederate will be defending a lot in this game, and so there will be 4 dice rolled by the defender. Other modifiers may apply, again, modify based on terrain, the presence of trenches. But you calculate the number of dice that you roll. You roll them as a defender. Each 6 that you roll is a hit inflicted on the opponent. Then the opponent does the same, rolling dice based on those numbers there, the firepower. This would be like 5 dice if there are no other modifications. Here that would be 3, but modified by the river. So the attacker rolls dice. And then you have the number of hits that the two sides are inflicting on one another. Important, when you inflict a hit, you have to keep track of who got a hit, because after hits have been applied, for each hit that a unit took, you need to roll a morale check. So you roll a die for each hit that the unit took, and if any of the die shows a number which is higher than the morale of the unit, as you can see, the morale of the unit also will change based on the block of the unit. If you roll higher than the morale of the unit, then you move the unit to the fail morale area, and that unit cannot contribute to combat. After you fired, defended an attacker, you applied hits, you check morale, the players can choose to stay in the battle or to retreat. If they don't retreat, then there's going to be another round of battle. If one of the sides decides to retreat, then the other side gets to fire at them once more, but with only 1 die per combat unit. If the two sides don't decide to retreat, no one decides to retreat, you fight another round of battle, but it may be the one side then has all of their units destroyed and or moved to the fail morale, then that side has to retreat, and in that case they're also taking fire from the opponent, but not anymore just 1 die per block, but now normal combat, normal fire. That means possibly multiple dice. So being forced to retreat because your units fail morale is much more devastating, because you're going to get some really intense fire as you retreat, as opposed to if you have an orderly retreat. You may take some fire, but it may be a little less problematic. You take less damage. A couple of extra rules that tell you when you get replacements, when you get reinforcements. A special rule allows the Confederate player to evacuate Port Hudson in turn 4. That may give certain advantages. So you have a couple of extra situations, extra rules that cram to the experience, but overall, this is the idea. Check the weather, assign command points, span command points to maneuver units. This is really a game of maneuver. Resolve battles, repeat until one of the players achieves instant victory, or until the end of the last turn, and then you determine victory based on the number of victory points that the Union player has collected. This is another solid design in the blue and gray system. I played in the past and I really enjoyed it, and I think this is a very strong, this is the 4th volume. I enjoyed them all actually, some more, some less, but this is a very strong, very solid entry. In particular, it is one that is very suitable for solitaire play. These days, many of us play war games by themselves, and solitaire, both sides are the best of their possibilities. And this is what happens here. If you're playing the game solo, there is an AI, although I think what could be devised, you could probably write down general orders for Grant, or sort of like if-then chart for the Confederates and play one side against a sort of rudimentary area for the other ones. But you can play both sides at the best of your possibilities with the blocks face up, and the game works very well because, as I explained earlier, you do not have many units, so the possibility of tricking you in ambush are not that many, and also there isn't much fluctuation when it comes to the strength of the units or the type, the ability of the units. There are block games where, you know, you're walking in the woods of Shiloh and all of a sudden you're facing some guns or some infantry. That's very different. Here you do not have that situation here because the capability of the units is the same. So you do not lose much. And what you have here, whether you're playing solo or not, is a very interesting puzzle for the Confederate player. It seems to me the Confederate player will have a harder time. You probably want to give that side to the more seasoned players among you, because the Confederate player has weaker units, but the problem really is not necessarily weakness per se, is the fact that these units are fragmented into smaller groups and you do not have as many command points as the Union player. This captures very well the difference in command abilities of the two sides, which is one of the ways in which you can do that in a war game. And again, as I said in the introduction, if you hardwire those elements in the design, then the player doesn't have to implement rules. Simply, as you're playing with a Confederate player, you have a certain number of action points that you need to scatter around small units, as opposed to the Union player has these larger units. So with a single command point, you're moving pretty much like 11, 12 points of strength, as opposed to the other side, the Confederates spend 2 command points to move a total of maybe 6 strength points. So that to me is a very smart way of presenting disparity in command in a way that the player doesn't have to worry about from the point of view of implementation of the rules. You have to worry about it in terms of rules, in terms of strategy, of course, that's what I meant, because then you have that challenge as a Confederate player of figuring out where to pick your battle, where to build your trenches, where to delay, where to try to launch a counterattack, which is extremely complicated, where to try to outmaneuver and maybe cut supply lines. Again, not easy. The challenge for the Confederate player is considerable, but then of course, if you find that the game is more challenging for one side than the other, and considerably so, then you can play 2 games back to back and you switch sides with a human opponent. If you're playing solo, you do not have that problem. If not, you identify emotionally with the side that has the bigger challenge, and then of course you have the satisfaction of winning the game with the weaker side if you find that there is that situation there. Overall, the system works very well. It is a nice implementation of a system that we've seen in previous games in the Blue and Gray campaign. The components are very good. I like the mounted map. The blocks are nice. The stickers, not a problem there. Sometimes when you have block games, the stickers kind of like they're not cut very well, and then you see the edge of the sticker on the block that looks a little rough and irregular. No problem here. The stickers were just coming off the sheet like, I don't know, meat of a well-cooked rib. So really nice components, nice system in general, nice implementation of the system. Again, very minimalistic war game here, maybe like a bonsai almost, but through that it really places the emphasis on maneuver. It really is a game of cat and mouse around Vicksburg and figuring out the timing, figuring out how to concentrate forces, how to and when to deliver a mighty attack. Really interesting little puzzle here. Pemberton and Grant, definitely an engaging game, a nice new addition to the Blue and Gray system. The system was strong already, it is stronger now that we have yet another good game in that system. Definitely fun game, and definitely recommended to beginner war gamers because the level of difficulty of the rules is, well, very low, incredibly accessible, very playable, and very fun. Pemberton and Grant by Worthington Games.